We've heard a lot about climate change-related news and events in recent years, even spanning decades. The ozone layer, greenhouse gases, fossil fuels, the list of buzzwords goes on. But what do you really know about climate change right now? And more importantly, how can we fight against it? Well, that's where these two words come in: mitigation and adaptation. And you might be asking yourself, what on earth? Don't worry, we have some help navigating this issue with our panel of experts. Joining us for today's discussion are Ms. Tan Hui Ling, Mr. Kamal Seth, and Dr. Daisuke Taira. Hui Ling is the Executive Director at Zero Waste SG, an NGO and charity driving zero waste actions through advocacy and education. Kamal is WWF Singapore's Climate and Sustainability Director. He leads efforts in transforming energy, infrastructure, and commodities markets for net zero and nature-positive goals. Daisuke is a marine biologist and a research fellow at the Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, National University of Singapore. His research explores how mangroves' nature-based solutions can be used to adapt to rising sea levels in Southeast Asia using geospatial data. And now that we have our panel of experts, let's start by asking a simple yet very important question. In a few words, what is climate change mitigation and adaptation? If, for example, you had to explain these concepts to, say, a stranger on the street. Hui Ling?
One, mitigation is how we can prevent climate change. And adaptation is really, much as we prevent, climate change is still going to hit us. How can we then address the impact of climate change that's going to hit us?
I think it also talks about transformational actions so that our current and future generations can inhabit a healthy planet and to live in harmony with nature. And the failure to do that, we already see extreme climate events. So I think that's how I would explain it.
Yeah.
So mitigation deals with the cause of climate change, which is emission of greenhouse gases. Adaptation deals with the consequence of climate change. Basically, we're trying to cope with the change caused by climate change.
All right, thank you guys. But it wouldn't be a complete discussion without first hearing what you guys have to say on the matter. Every thought counts, so let's check it out.
Mitigation and adaptation, not really.
Not very sure.
Don't really know what it's about.
More of what a person can do than adaptation can be the later part of it.
Prevention is better than cure.
Mitigation, we should prioritize because I think mitigation is something that we can educate the public.
Currently, mitigation is more prioritized than not adaptation, but based on the needs of Southeast Asia, actually adaptation is more of a pressing need.
The plastic bag thing that they implemented, now you need to pay for it, right? I want to pay for it, so I'll just carry all my things after I purchase it.
And that's the word from the street. Any immediate thoughts? Have any of these sound bites resonated with you?
Yeah, I think the lady who mentioned about climate adaptation and how in Southeast Asia that is the need of the hour. And often what happens, as she rightly pointed out, that a lot of us focus on climate mitigation, on what to avoid, but it's as important to make people responsible and also do the adaptation measures so that they feel safe, especially in the coastal areas.
Yeah, I think it was quite interesting, as in there were many, they covered many different topics in different locations, different countries require different types of climate adaptation method that is adapted and suitable for their own needs.
Like Daisuke, I felt that I really appreciated the diversity of views and that people really had something to say about the topic. Not so sure about the whole mitigation adaptation kind of tussle, but I think we'll get into that later on.
So earlier on, we briefly touched on climate change mitigation, but could you tell me a bit more about what it actually is?
Yes, so climate change mitigation are any actions taken by governments, businesses, or people to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. That could be done by shifting to renewable energy, that could be done by regenerative agricultural practices, any actions that we take as human beings that would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from going into the atmosphere.
So I think one of the things that we always mention when it comes to climate action or climate change mitigation is this notion of carbon footprint or decarbonization and net zero. So to just give a really quick definition of greenhouse gas, right? These are carbon-based gases in the atmosphere which trap a lot of heat. And when the heat is trapped, that raises the temperature of the atmosphere and then that messes with our weather systems and causes climate change. So what we really want to do in mitigation is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions or reduce our carbon footprint.
So an example of that would be actions taken to transition to renewable energy or reducing our fossil fuel consumption. Nature itself has a role to play. Nature has the potential to absorb 1/3 of the carbon that is in the atmosphere. So through nature-based solutions that we'll talk about more as we go along, we have the power to mitigate climate change through nature-based solutions.
And things like a nature-based solution, it used to be, biodiversity is being lost, so we need to protect them. So if you look at the area that has been deforested, deforestation contributes a lot to the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But these forests are very important carbon sink, which means that they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, then they can capture and store for a long time in their roots, trunk, and their branches. So destroying these habitats and ecosystem can adversely affect our climate. So I think it's important to understand that climate change has no border. So whatever action you take locally will affect elsewhere as well. And climate change is also very time sensitive. So later you take action to mitigate impacts, and the more impact you get.
So now that we've talked a bit more about what climate change mitigation is, what about climate change adaptation? Daisuke, what is that?
So adaptation means that we live with the change that is caused by climate change, and also prepare for the potential damage that's caused by climate change. But this is very important because, as we said, the current mitigation measures are not doing enough, that the change will happen, so we have to adapt to the new environment and the climate.
So adaptation is really, it's not pessimistic, but a realistic way of saying, hey, we need to maybe change the way we live, work, and play in this new order, so to speak.
Yes, I think we need to ask ourselves how we live, how we work, and how we build. And climate adaptation should address all three levels. So case in point, people living in the coastal community, especially in Southeast Asia. So if there were lack of nature-based solutions, you would have to build like sea walls, because you're trying to protect people from higher sea rise or sea levels. But that must be done in harmony with nature, because if you were to put all the concrete out there, it's not going to be good for biodiversity, for example, or the corals or the turtles who might be the local inhabitants of that area.
My next question is, are there any trade-offs or opportunity costs in choosing one over the other?
Both adaptation solutions or mitigation solutions, they're all going to cost money and resources. And insofar as we don't have an unlimited budget, we are going to have to make some prioritization or trade-offs when it comes to selecting the best solutions for us.
So the benefits of climate adaptation measures are much more visible in the short term, whereas the benefits of climate mitigation might not be visible even for a generation. It might take 10 years to restore a forest, for example. So we have to be very mindful of the fact that the timeframes are very different in that trade-offs. And then tough decisions, as Sui Ling mentioned, have to be made, in which you say there's a trade-off between adaptation and mitigation, but what my people need in the next 3 years is probably a green sea wall full of mangroves. And then you divert your resources to that solution. So cannot work on just adaptation, cannot work on just mitigation, because they are so interlinked that if you do too much of one, you're probably worsening the other one.
And Daisuke, do you think there are any trade-offs or opportunity costs when it comes to choosing either or?
We can't just focus on mitigation and without adaptation, because changes are happening. And adaptation should be the way to buy time, so that we can have enough time to reverse climate change trends. Nature-based solutions also takes time to actually see the impact.
So we've talked about trade-offs and opportunity costs when it comes to choosing between mitigation and adaptation. But what about synergies? You know, having both of them. Like, are there any policies, for example, which kill two birds with one stone?
I don't think we are killing any birds as a part of this conversation, but how do we get double benefits? So on a serious note, how can the same set of efforts create twice or thrice the benefits, right? Let me use an example for ecosystem services. Communities around the world, the farming communities, they need fresh water to produce, and that is a very important source for the agriculture ecosystem. Now, if there were not enough natural ecosystems like mangroves or tropical rainforests, there would not be enough underground water for the agriculture system to thrive. So that's a good way to say that by doing one action, in which case you are restoring an ecosystem, which leads to higher water tables underneath the ground, which then creates enough fresh water supply for the farmers around the world to have enough to produce the food that we need.
It's not just about adaptation, mitigation, but there are also core benefits by protecting nature. There's something called agroforestry. So you can, for example, you can plant the palm trees, and that can capture and sequester carbons from the atmosphere, basically stabilize the ground that can prevent the flooding. Mangrove restoration as well, you can actually combine with the coastal defense structure. For example, Singapore has very little land, and we have very little mangrove as well. The mangrove alone may not function as a coastal defense system because it's small. But if you can combine with, let's say you have a breakwater in front of mangrove that can probably also mitigate the sea level rise impact, then mangrove can further mitigate the impact as well.
I think we talked a lot about how we reduce our consumption, we reduce our carbon footprint, we also reduce the trash that's getting generated, and that reduces the carbon footprint involved in managing that trash. So we see a lot of it as mitigation efforts. But now we think about trash as something that needs to be disposed of in a landfill. In our landfill in Semakau, one and only, right? With climate change impacting both the demands on space in Singapore as well as in other countries. We're not going to have another landfill if Semakau gets filled up. So one way of having to adapt to increased competition for land is really to then cut down on the trash that we're generating and that needs to go into the landfill. So we look at it in a more holistic term, really Semakau, or waste generation and consumption, is something that we need for both mitigation and adaptation.
So having had this discussion all together, is there a message or a call to action that you would like to leave our audience with?
So just to paraphrase a saying, we don't have to do everything perfectly, but we need millions to do it imperfectly. So just like to encourage everyone to take that first step in your climate action journey. Doesn't matter whether you are reducing plastic or recycling better. I think it would be great if you can understand how that links to the bigger picture, understand how that's applicable to your context. But just know that every individual contribution makes a difference when we come together collectively.
So my call to action to people is simply to be the change. Everything that you put on social media or you say to someone else, like a friend, you should be able to challenge yourself to actually do it yourself. That if you're talking about plastic straw issues, don't use one yourself. If you're talking about single-use plastic, don't use one yourself. So be the change you want to see and walk the talk. That's very, very important, and that's what my ask from all the people watching this would be.
Everything is linked, so your action will be affecting yourself or some people or someone else one way or another. Hopefully you learn something new from this discussion and do your part. We can do it.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for sharing and enlightening us today on what's actually going on in the world right now as we speak. I hope you've all learned something new. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Climate change is a real and tangible threat to our world. That's why we as a society need to work together to fight against it in any way we can. Every step counts, just like every drop of water amounts to our vast oceans. And if you want to find out more, you can check out Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future by Elizabeth Colbert, Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All by Michael Schellenberger, and The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet by Jeff Goodall. You can find all these books at your nearest library or on the NLB mobile app. And to check out our take on other exciting issues, be sure to check out the Read to Be Sure website. Lastly, we want to know what you think. Which is more important to you, mitigation or adaptation? Let us know in the comment section down below.